Hey there! So, enough talking about Data Factory and its CI/CD pipelines. Let's finally talk about some other services we could use to ingest data, apart from Data Factory. And the service that I want to talk about is Logic App. And I know Logic Apps are not in the scope of DP203 exam, but as a data engineer, you will use them quite often. That's why I believe it's pretty important for you to at least know that they exist. So Logic Apps, that's the topic for today. So let's get started. Alright, Logic Apps. So what are they and why we would like to use them? So actually, so far I used Logic Apps in the episode when I was talking about error handling in Data Factory. So let's revisit this scenario. So it was like this. We had our wonderful pipeline in Data Factory. So this is ADF pipeline. It had some activities, defined various tasks that were connected using different connectors. Let's say those green on success ones. But we are realistic and we know that some of those tasks might fail from time to time. And it even might be not our fault. It might be some networking issue. It might be some issue with Azure. And we just want to be prepared for this. So what might be done in such cases is to prepare some error handling logic. And one of the good ways to do this is to create a dedicated Data Factory pipeline, assuming that we are using Data Factory, that will be used only for error handling. And then, in our main pipeline, we would configure this error handling logic using one of the patterns that I was talking about. And simply the step that should be executed as a result of the error would call our error handling pipeline. And inside this pipeline, we again might have different activities, different tasks. And very often, what we would like to happen is to send an email if something bad happens. Great, but that's one of those tiny pieces that ADF lacks when it comes to functionality. There is no activity that we could use to send email. Simply there isn't, at least not at this moment. And Logic Apps are useful just in those cases, just to fill those tiny parts of the solution that otherwise are either difficult to be implemented in a different way or simply impossible to do using those main services like Data Factory. So in our case, what we did in that episode with error handling was to create a Logic App. So this is a Logic App, very simple one that was used to send an email to someone. And in our error handling pipeline, we would be simply calling or executing this Logic App, as simple as that. So the Logic App would be triggered like a web service by a HTTP request. And that's one of the most commonly used use cases for Logic Apps. Just send an email. Or to generalize it a bit, just to send some kind of notifications. Because maybe instead of sending an email, we would like to send a message to a Teams channel. And again, Logic Apps can do it very nicely. Because Logic Apps are those no-code or low-code integration services, in the case of which we just drag and drop various stuff into the canvas and connect various services together. And like ADF, Logic Apps have a lot of connectors built in, but Logic Apps have more of them available. That's why sometimes it's easier to achieve something using Logic App than an ADF pipeline. But please remember that Logic Apps are not meant to replace ADF. No. I prefer to use them just to fill those missing gaps in ADF stuff. Alright, but we are still talking about this ingest phase, when we want to connect to some data source, grab the data, and dump it to a data lake into the raw layer. So can Logic Apps be useful here? Yes. And the main part of this episode will be about this scenario, how to grab file from SharePoint and dump it to a data lake. Alright, but why SharePoint? Well, again, this is a very common use case that business users would have some Excel file that they would be working on, that they would be updating quite often. So we've got multiple users who want to collaborate on the same file, and somehow they have to have such possibility. Instead of sending different versions of the Excel file via mails to every member of the team, what is often done is to simply put this file into SharePoint Online nowadays, which is this big collaboration platform from Microsoft. So this is SharePoint. And this file, this Excel file, is uploaded there. And now each of those business users can simply use a browser to connect to this file and update it online. And every team member will see a synchronized version of this file. So the collaboration is very easy in this case. And now we, as data engineers, we are given a task to ingest this Excel file from SharePoint because it contains important information that we have to process somehow. So our case for today is like this. So we have this SharePoint with some Excel file, and we have our target data lake. And simply we want to ingest the file, like so. And let me show you that indeed I have my SharePoint Online configured with this Excel file. So let's jump into a browser. Alright, so this is SharePoint. And don't worry, SharePoint is a big topic. It is completely out of the scope of DP203 exam. But you as a data engineer, you will always have to get the data from it. So at least a basic knowledge will be useful. And here in this main information site, which was created from default template, so it doesn't contain any data, apart from this documents library, because what I created here was this sales by country Excel file. And if I open it, you will see that it contains some dummy sales data. And various users will be able to connect to this file using a browser and then just update the values however they want. And this data will be automatically saved. That's the feature of SharePoint. It will be versioned, and us as a data engineers, we will have to just ingest this data. Alright, but the first thing you should do as a data engineer would be to check if we can do this ingest phase from SharePoint by using Data Factory. So let's jump into my dev data factory table. That's the development instance of Data Factory that has this CI/CD stuff configured. And usually when we want to connect to some new data source, what we have to do is simply create a linked service, this connection string. So let's see if there is anything related to SharePoint. And please note that there is called SharePoint Online list, but it is a linked service to a list, not to a library. And the difference is crucial because a list is completely different thing than a library. And let me show it to you. So library this documents library is like a directory inside which we can store various files, like those Excel ones. On the other hand, I have a list created called books, and let me show you how it looks like. So a list is just a list which has various columns defined with various values. Obviously, we can edit the structure of this list. We can add columns with different types. However you want. Let's say, let's add a new text column called, I don't know, did you like it? Did you like it? Like so. So someone who would be maintaining this list could edit this Alice Adventure in Wonderland book, this entry, and enter if you like it. Yes, it was pretty cool book, like so. So this is a list, but here in the list we cannot store files. It's not meant to store files, which means that this linked service that we have available in Data Factory will not work in our case, because we want to grab file from a library, not from a list. So it won't work. Which means that out of the box, Data Factory doesn't have a connector that would work in our case. Alright, but for sure we can do it in a different way using Data Factory. Maybe SharePoint exposes some API we could use just to grab this file. So let's try to find SharePoint REST API. And yes, there are APIs, even multiple versions, V1 and V2. So basically, if we would like to use the API, we'll find a way to do this. We'll find a way in the API, find a proper method that would allow us to connect to a specific library and grab a file from it using this web request. But the issue here is that it's not that easy. This data engineer would have to go through this API documentation. He would have to understand it, and it might not be that easy. This person would have to understand how to authenticate, how to be authorized, how to craft this web request. And maybe it's simply too complicated. Maybe there are other ways to do this faster and simpler. And that's the place where Logic Apps can be used. Because, as I said, Logic Apps can be used just to fill those tiny gaps that otherwise are difficult to be implemented. So we know that Data Factory, well, we will be able to do this using this API. But let's try to do this a Logic App, and you will see how easy it is. Alright, so let's create a Logic App, and then I will show you how it looks like. So let's jump into Azure Portal, and let's create a Logic App, a very simple one. So actually, I will create a new resource group for Logic Apps, just to show you what kind of objects are created together with Logic App, because that's something very important. So Logic App DP203 resource group. That's fine. Now let's give it a name for the Logic App. SharePoint ingest file table, whatever. Region, let's keep it in West Europe, because that's where the rest of my stuff is located. And then we've got important decision to make. What plant type should be used? And discussion about different plant types is beyond the scope of this episode. Basically, it impacts what kind of features you will have with your Logic App and how much you will pay for it. For start, when we want to start playing with Logic Apps, the consumption model or plant type is the best, because here we don't have to care about any infrastructure at all. It will be handled by Azure. And secondly, we will pay only for those executions that were actually occurring. So we'll pay for as much as we used the logic app. And that's it. So let me create it. And it should be a very fast operation, like a few seconds or so. And then we'll go into the logic app and start creating it. Alright, so let's go to the resource. And here, two most important tabs, at least for now, are those two. Logic App Designer, that's a human-friendly UI inside which we will be developing our logic apps by just dragging and dropping various operations. And also we have a code view that shows the code of our logic app as JSON. So it depends which view is better for you. But today we will start with the Logic App Designer, this human-friendly one. Alright, so let's jump into it. And in a second you will see that we have various ways we could start developing our logic apps. So if you think about it, first of all, we have to define a way how our logic apps will be started. What will trigger it? That's what this is something that is called a trigger inside a logic apps, how we would like it to be executed. And we've got various ways we could use. So for example, one of the common ways is to simply set a schedule, like once a day, this recurrence one. Or maybe we would like to run our logic apps explicitly upon a web request, like a web service. That's what we did in the case of this logic app used to send emails. Then I used this when a HTTP request is received trigger. Or maybe we would like to run our logic apps whenever a new file is created on OneDrive, and so on and so on. We've got a lot of triggers available, but we won't use any of them because we want to focus on SharePoint. Then, if I scroll down, I could also use an existing template just to make development of the logic apps faster. So, for example, we have a very simple template that just have two activities: get some HTTP request and send a response. Very simple web service. Or maybe we would like to design our logic app in a way that it would listen for changes in a SharePoint list, and if something is detected, just send an email. Maybe. Or maybe we would like to use the template that says just monitor some Dropbox, and whenever a new file appears there, just copy it to OneDrive, and so on and so on. So those templates here, they should make your development easier, because they should give you a hint what can be accomplished using logic apps. But in our case, we will start from an empty logic app, blank one, because I want to create everything from scratch. Alright, and what we see right here in the middle, that's our canvas. It's empty right now because we didn't use any template and we didn't drag any operation yet. So the first thing we've got to do is to define a trigger for our logic app. Define how it will be executed. And in our case, we know that we want to read data from SharePoint. So let's start typing SharePoint and see if there is any trigger available for us. So we have this SharePoint category, and we have two things: triggers and actions. Right now, we are interested in triggers because we want to specify how this logic app will be executed. And the list is quite long, so let's see if there is anything that might be useful. And actually, take a look at this one. When a file is created or modified in a SharePoint. So let's take a look at it. And now, important thing. Because Logic App is a different service than SharePoint, we have to define how our Logic App will connect to SharePoint, how it will authenticate. That's what this create a connection to SharePoint message means. So if we go back to our drawing, we decided that we would like to use a Logic App to do this ingestion process. And now what we have to decide is, alright, but how this Logic App will connect to SharePoint. And in a second we will have the same decision to make, how this Logic App will connect to our data lake. And that's what I want to focus on right now. So basically, Logic App will allow us to log in as someone and use this person's credentials to connect to a SharePoint. Now, please pay a lot of attention to what account you're using. Because if I log in as me, as Piotr, it would mean that this Logic App will be able to impersonate me. And because I'm the admin, I can do everything inside SharePoint. I can even remove everything from it. And later on, you will see that those credentials that we used to create the connection will be saved in Azure. So any other Logic App created by someone else inside our environment could also reuse this connection object. And it could connect as me. And that's pretty dangerous. So no, I don't want to use my connection. So let me show you what I did. So inside this main information site, what I did was to grant a read access, not write, to this dedicated account I created called ingest account. So I will be using this user to connect to SharePoint. And that's a best practice, just use a dedicated account. Alright, so let's log in as this ingest account from our Logic App. So one more time, log in, not as me, but as this ingest account identity. Like so. Okay, so I was authenticated. My credentials were saved in Azure. Right now I'm connected as this ingest account, and I have to configure this trigger. So Logic App would know to which library I want to connect. And now, because my ingest account has limited permissions, it doesn't have permissions to list every site available in my SharePoint. I could have done it in a better way. I could have granted it some permissions, but that's not an issue, because I know that the address I have to use is this one. That's the site address. So let me copy it and let me paste it. Oh, come on, one more time. Alright, now it's better. Then we've got to indicate, alright, inside this site, which library are we talking about? And here, I know that's the documents library. And now my account, my ingest account, can list all libraries because it is granted access. So let's use this documents library. And finally, we've got to define how often should this Logic App check for changes. So you can see it's a kind of a polling approach. It's a Logic App that it's constantly going to the SharePoint and is asking, hey, has anything changed? Has anything changed? And so on. And here we can define how often we want this process to happen. And just to make it faster for the demo, I will set it to run every 15 seconds. And let me save it. Alright, so right now we just have a trigger inside our Logic app. It doesn't do anything yet, but it should run. It should be started whenever it detects that something has changed inside our file that is stored in this library. So let me update the file. And let's go back to our Logic app. And here, in this trigger history, you can see that it is executed every 15 seconds or so. And in a second, we should see that actually it started, because it detected that the file has changed. So let's wait for it, and we'll see how it looks like. Alright, and we can see that it has been fired, the trigger. The Logic app also has been triggered, and please note that we've got two separate tabs for these two type of starts. Run, it means that the Logic app actually started, and trigger history, it shows how often the trigger just was started, and if it found anything, in our case any changes in the library, so it would start the Logic app. Now if I click at this Logic app run, I should see quite a lot of data from our trigger. And this will be very useful, because later on we'll make use of those outputs. So basically you can see what were the inputs configured for this trigger, and basically it says where the Logic app should monitor for changes. But what is more important for us are the outputs, because here we can find information about a file that was detected as changed. And for example, we can see who changed the file. We can see what file was changed, and that's the identifier field, and we'll use it later on. We can get a link to this particular file. We can get its name with an extension, and so on. So we got this metadata about the file that was changed. But please note that nowhere here we've got a file content. No. Why? Because the task that we've used, it is called, oh come on, please open. It is called properties only. So we've got only those properties about the file, this metadata. So in order to copy this file, we'll have to grab it, and we'll do this in a second. Alright, but before we do this, let's go back to the authorization and authentication phase. So we know we configured the Logic app to use this ingest account, and it worked. And now we've got to do something similar for Logic app, and let's do this right now, so Azure will have few minutes just to propagate this information. So to be able to save data to a data lake, we know that, well, there are various ways we could use to authenticate. But since we already have this ingest account created, let's continue using it. And in this case, we could use role-based access control. And you should remember that the storage blob data contributor role grants sufficient permissions just to read and write data to a data lake. And now I could grant this ingest account the role explicitly on the data lake, but let's use a group as a middleware just to follow best practices. So let's jump into Microsoft Entra. That's where users and groups can be created, and let's create a group Or maybe I have some group already. Alright, so I have this data lake contributor group. That's cool. So let's add a new member to it. We already have some, I believe this was managed identity for data factory. So let's add this ingest account. Alright, so it's done. So right now our data lake contributor contains 2 accounts. And then let's use this group on our data lake. And actually I will make use of this table data lake demo storage account. I don't remember if it was the one that we used in the past, but let's just use it. And let's check who is granted access. Maybe this group is already granted the access. Storage blob data contributor? Yep, it is. Right? That's the group, data lake contributor. And we've just added our ingest account to it. So we should be fine. And take a look how good practice it is to use those groups. Because we don't have to create multiple entries for every account that should have access to a data lake. No, we just create a group and add multiple principals to it. Alright, so let's go back to our Logic app. So we know what file was changed. So the next thing to do is to grab the file, because we want to grab its content. So let's simply add a new step to our Logic app and let's indicate what we want to do. So we know that we have to still connect to a SharePoint library just to grab this file. So let's continue to use SharePoint, but this time instead of triggers we want to use actions. And let's go through a list of actions we have available. And there should be something called get file content. And that's the one. Alright, so let's use it. And again, we've got to configure this action. Again, we've got to provide the site address. So let's simply copy it from the trigger. Like so. Then we've got to indicate what file we want to get. And you should remember that actually you got this identifier output from the trigger. And the nice thing about Logic Apps that we can reference previous activities and their outputs. So let me show you how to make it work. So let's just click on this file identifier, and there here on the right hand side you can see this additional pop-up that you can use to make the value of this particular field dynamic. And for example, we can see those various outputs that are made available from our trigger. This when a file is created or modified. So that's this operation. So what we have to do right now is to find this identifier property from this list. Unfortunately, it's not sorted alphabetically. So let's just scroll it, and yep, that's the identifier. So hopefully this field will work just fine. Alright, and that's it. So let me save it. So how it will work? So the Logic app will wake up whenever a file is updated in the list. It will grab its identifier, and then it will execute this get file content action, which will then use this identifier to go to a specific file. So that sounds fine so far. So the next thing we want to do is to save this data to a data lake. And by the way, take a look how easy it was to configure the connection to a SharePoint. We didn't have to bother with any kind of APIs because Logic Apps have this SharePoint connector available out of the box. And we just had to drag it into the canvas and configure it. So it's super simple. Alright, so let's add a step to save this file to a data lake. And I know that we can use this Azure Blob Storage category. And here we've got to select an action that will allow us to create a file. And here we've got this create blob v2. And blob is just a file. So this operation should work just fine. And again, we've got to indicate how this logic app should connect to a data lake. And we've got different methods available. And we discussed them previously. For sure, access key is not the best way. But since we have a dedicated account already created, we can use it here. Or maybe if we didn't want to use a dedicated account, we could use a managed identity of this logic app. So both approaches would work just fine. But let's use this one. Let's give a name to a connection that will be created, like data lake connection. And let me sign in as this ingest account. Alright, it should work. And then we've got to configure this action, namely indicate which storage account we are talking about and where in it we should save the file. And now let me provide a name of this. Oh, come on. Let me provide a name of this storage account. Then let's try to provide a path to it. And actually, we know that it should be under row, but we didn't create a dedicated directory for it. So let's quickly do this. So let's go into containers, row. We've got those directories for SAP, for databases. So let's create a new one for SharePoint. Like so. So again, let's indicate where we want this data to be saved. To a SharePoint, please. Alright. Then we have to indicate how this file should be named. And let's just reuse its original name. So again, let's make this field dynamic. So let me click on it. And here we should find this file name something property. Yeah, that's the one. File name with extension. So in our case, it would be salesbycountry.xlsx. Like so. That's great. And finally, we've got to define what is the content of our blob, of our file. And here, again, we want to make it dynamic. And this time, we would grab this file content output from this get file content action. Like so. And that's it. So let's save it. Let's modify our file in SharePoint. Let's just verify that our row container and SharePoint directory is empty. So let's verify if it would work. Like, let's add freeze. And in just 15 seconds or so, this logic app should detect that, hey, the file has changed. And if I configure it properly, it should trigger the logic app, get the content of the file, and dump it into a data lake. So it should work just fine. So let's refresh the view. Not yet. So let's wait a second. All right. So I can see in the run history of our logic app that we have a second run locked. So it means that our logic app has been executed. So let's go into our row container. Let's refresh the view, and there it is. We have our sales by country Excel file. So let me quickly download it, and let's see if it really contains the data that it should. So let me just drag it into the screen. And yep, we've got this 3333 as sales for US. And that's it. So you can see how easy it was to fill in this missing gap in data factory functionality just by using a Logic App. So let's revisit our diagram and let's draw it. Alright, so let's jump into whiteboard. So what we did was to create this very simple Logic App, this one, that used out-of-the-box connectors to a SharePoint and to a data lake that was able to detect whenever a file was changed in the library and then just drag the file, copy it, and dump into a data lake. Very simple. And then once we already have the file inside our data lake, we can proceed with other activities on it. Now, one more thing to discuss is, alright, but how do we want to trigger our Logic App? Do we really want it to be started every 15 seconds? In real life, probably not, because what's the point of doing this? And again, it depends on our requirements. It depends how often this file changes. If it changes very frequently, like every hour, and if we want to always have a current version inside our data lake, then maybe we would like to set the scheduling inside our Logic App, maybe to execute it every hour or so, which would mean that we would always have pretty much up-to-date version of the file. Maybe that's what we want. But please remember that in this case, we would have two places in which scheduling is defined. One would be this Logic App, and separately, we would have probably those triggers inside Data Factory, which is usually our main orchestration engine. So instead, maybe what we would like to do is to simply call our Logic App from a Data Factory. So we would change a trigger to this HTTP request from the one that we currently have that checks for changes inside a library. Again, it depends on our case. It depends what we want to achieve and how often the file changes. Please also note that if we introduce Logic Apps to our solution, it means that we would have to care about CI/CD for it, about code repository, about storing the code of the Logic App somewhere. And in the case of Logic Apps, this CI/CD stuff is not that simple. At least not as simple as in case of Data Factory. So it's always a balance between simplicity, complexity, and what we want to achieve. But anyway, most likely you would be using Logic Apps here or there, somewhere in the solution. So you should know how they look like. And one more thing that I want to talk about are those additional resources created with a Logic App. So you should remember that I deployed the Logic App into a dedicated resource group, just to show you what resources are created. So we have our Logic App that does the copying stuff from SharePoint to a data lake. And apart from that, we've got two API connections. And those API connections are resources that stores our credentials. So for example, let's take a look at this SharePoint Online connector and let's switch to a JSON view. You'll see that here it uses this ingest account as its identity, right? The same happens in the case of this connection to a data lake, because that's how we configured it. It again uses this ingest account. And now since those connections just are stored here in this resource group, then any new logic app that we would create, they would be able to use those connections. And if I used my identity here, it might be a security risk, because someone might connect to a data lake as me, and because I have full access there, it could be a catastrophe. It could be very dangerous to do so. So pay attention to what kind of connection or what kind of identity you're using. Alright, so these were the logic apps. So to summarize, logic apps are those nice fillers that you could use in places where ADF doesn't work that well, just to fill those small tiny gaps, like to send email, grab a file from SharePoint, or integrate with some service, in case of which Data Factory doesn't work that well. But please don't try to replace your Data Factory orchestration process with logic apps, because logic apps were not meant for this type of huge integrations. And secondly, please pay attention to connections. What type of identity you're using to connect to various services, because if you don't pay attention, then it might be a security risk, and someone else might be able to use those identities to do some malicious stuff. And that's it for today. I hope it was useful. Thanks for watching and see you next time. Take care.